Greetings and blessings to each one of you once again. On this new morning, the Lord has brought each one of us in worship once again to spend these moments in His presence. For it is in His presence that we receive from Him His divine instructions. In His presence, we have strength and moral courage to live our Christian life and to feel God's awesome presence is such a wonderful experience that each one of us, always conscious that God is with us, He is watching over us, and He desires the very best for each one of us. This morning, we will continue our study from the book of Proverbs in chapter 28. We will focus today on verse 3 of Proverbs 28, reading the inspired word. A poor man who oppresses the poor is like a driving rain which leaves no food. A very interesting proverb, which on the outside may not mean much, but as we dwell into understanding the intricacies, we can see God, who is in such close observance of His people and of the things that are happening on this earth. On the outside, to hear a poor man oppressing the poor may not seem telling us much. As a poor person, we would expect that a poor person will likewise treat another poor person with much kindness and love. But here, quite contrary, we see a poor man who oppresses another poor person. God, who watches over things happening on this earth, who sees what human beings are indulging in, and God, seeing what is happening on this earth, He will not keep quiet. He will not allow things to happen in their own course, allow things to happen contrary to His will. For God desires the best for His people, and so He instructs, He warns, He admonishes about the way how things are happening in this wicked world. Often we think it is the rich who are oppressing the poor. And so the rich many times are blamed for oppressing the poor. But interestingly, besides the obvious, we even see that which we may not even imagine, the poor oppressing the poor. This, in a way, highlights the irony of how one human being oppresses another person. Somehow it has become part of human nature to oppress one another. This is surely the consequence of sin. Sin which has resulted in making those who go contrary to God's law and who indulge in sin to experience the consequences of sin, of misery, of suffering, of pain, and even death. But besides, human beings have learned to accuse one another, to blame one another, and even to oppress one another. Right there, even in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, created by God in a sinless condition, placed them in such beautiful ambience where there is no evil, wickedness, everything was holy, righteous. But in such situation, after creating Eve, Adam expressed his deep, intense love for Eve, recognizing in the beautiful first song, the first love song in Genesis, where Adam sings to his wife, "Now you are bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Out of man you've been taken, you will be called a woman." Adam, who had such deep love, such strong emotional bonding with his wife, in an unsinful condition, in such holy, righteous relationship. But once sin came about, human relationships began to change, unfortunately, for the worse. Adam, who he was able to only after sin begin to accuse her. Adam began to accuse Eve, making her responsible for his sin. Eve then accused Satan of tempting her. So we see here human beings who are made to love one another, to reflect the Creator's love. They have only learned to accuse one another. Thus, that relationship was broken. How unfortunate that sin sprang up and broke that loving relationship, and one human being oppressing, accusing, making others responsible for your sin. Knowing well that the power of choice that human beings were given could result in such human behavior, the plan of salvation was already in place. But this situation persisted, though it is contrary to God's way. The world became more and more sinful, and even the poor oppressing their fellow who are poor or even more poorer.
Doctor, we
Doctor, you're
lost
not
connection.
audible.
We lost connection.
Yes, as we see in human relationships have altered because sin and its consequences have strained the relationships, and human beings begin to accuse one another and even ill treat and oppress one another. How unfortunate. This kind of unnatural oppression is because when one sinful person, though he may be from a poor background, when he gains power, he becomes more ruthless even than a rich person who may oppress. For the rich may have love and courtesy for one another, but not a poor person who has come to some level of leadership and the way how he would deal with those who are poorer than him. Somebody has compared such kind of behavior to a hungry leech, which can suck harder than one who is already filled. This kind of unnatural oppression that human beings express certainly is more destructive as compared to a sweeping rain. This analogy in this proverb, which describes a severe, violent storm, which has power to destroy, wash away the harvest, causing such great damage to the crops. Rain, which is supposed to give nourishment, make the plants to grow, and help the crop to yield better, can have destructive impact by the way how rain, if it is a gentle rain, it does its work positively, but a strong, violent, aggressive rain can only cause damage. We can see such kind of behavior in especially leaders who did rise from lower backgrounds, from a poor context. And when such a leader, when he comes to power, he forgets from where he has risen. He who was once at such level now acts contrary in dealing with his fellow poor people, becomes more abusive, becomes more oppressive, forgetting formerly his poor condition. Instead of humbling himself, remembering his origins, takes advantage of the poor people who are in his care. For those who have gone from one stage to higher levels should not forget those who are in that lower state of poverty. Such is so against human behavior. For such people have allowed sin to control their lives, and for treating one another equally or even better, they only, on the other hand, oppress and act aggressively towards those who are below them. Such experience that we see in those who did rise from their levels of poverty is beautifully illustrated by a parable that Jesus told in Matthew chapter 18, where we have the story of two debtors. A king, a rich man who wanted to settle his accounts with his servants, he calls for them to settle accounts, and as one by one came, he encounters a servant who owed him a massive debt payable. The story tells us that here was a servant who owed him 10,000 talents, which is a large sum of money, equal to many years of wages. Seemingly impossible for that debtor who owed his king 10,000 talents. But he pleaded with him. He begs for mercy and time. The king, who was moved with compassion, seeing the plight of this servant who had no possibilities of repaying his debt, cancels the entire massive debt of 10,000 talents. This servant, whose large debt was cancelled, was so grateful, of course, but as he went out from the king's presence, he sees a fellow servant who owed him a small amount of about 100 denarii. He caught him by his neck and forced him to pay that 100 denarii that he owed him. And this poor servant also begged for mercy, asked him for a little time when he could repay it back. But this servant, whose large debt was cancelled, could not forgive his fellow servant who owed him a small amount of about 100 denarii. He had him thrown into the prison because he cannot pay back. This behavior is what the proverb is describing. A poor person who cannot show his consideration to a fellow poor person. A poor person who oppresses his fellow servant. And now the king comes to know what this servant, for whom he cancelled a very large debt of 10,000 denarii, did to his fellow servant. Hearing that he was not considerate to a fellow servant, he calls the servant back, hands him over to the jailers to be tortured till he would pay the last denarii that he owed. Jesus, in a very subtle way, yet in a very practical lesson, he teaches how we should deal with our fellow human beings. For we all are sinners. Jesus was teaching a very important lesson through this parable. When Peter asked him how many times one should forgive the sins of others, Jesus responds beyond Peter's expectation. Peter thought to forgive 7 times. This complete number 7 was what his Jewish religion would teach him, to forgive 7 times. But Jesus said to forgive 70 times 7. 490 times. Would there be one person who would have wronged us 490 times? This expression only symbolizes that forgiveness should be limitless. We do not need to count how many times you are forgiving somebody. If God should do that, that would be even beyond count for the number of times we sin and seek for forgiveness. But this parable, in answer to Peter's question about forgiveness, is teaching us today that we should be willing to forgive as many times we are asked to forgive by our fellow brothers and sisters. For Jesus is telling us that God, who knows what's in the heart of every human being, you do not need to judge whether somebody is truly repentant or not. Our duty is to forgive. God's forgiveness towards us human beings, sinful human beings, is immense. Like the great debt of 10,000 talents, which there was really no possibility for the debtor to pay. But the wrongs that we fellow human beings do towards each other is comparatively small, about 100 denarii. But are we willing to forgive? We who experience God's forgiveness and His mercy, we should be willing to show the same to our fellow human beings. God is willing to forgive us, even the largest of debt. But are we willing even to forgive our fellow human beings, extending the same grace to others? We need to learn to be merciful and forgiving. Just as God has forgiven us, we should be willing to forgive our fellow human beings. This story reminds us that forgiveness has to be experienced. Then alone you would be willing to forgive somebody. While he received forgiveness, this large debtor, he received forgiveness, he did not experience it. So therefore, he was not prepared to forgive his fellow servant. God is ever willing to forgive, but you have to receive and experience forgiveness. Many times, we, like this large debtor, seek for forgiveness, but still hold within us resentment and failing to forgive. This attitude only makes us imprisoned by our own unwillingness to forgive others and to accept and experience God's forgiveness. This parable that Jesus told teaches us that we should, in forgiving, must be heartfelt, not merely on the surface by word of mouth, but we should forgive from our heart. And once we forgive, we should be willing to forget and not to hold that sin against that person who has wronged us. For the way how God forgives us, he not only forgives us, but cleanses us from all unrighteousness. And he says, I will cast your sin as far as the east is from the west, and to the very depths of the sea. That is how God forgives us our sins. But we many times still retain that act of sin committed against us. And if you still have that hangover, it is because you have not truly forgiven your brother or sister. For if you have forgiven them wholeheartedly, your sin and that wrong would be even erased from your mind, because you do not hold that against that brother who did or sister against you. Forgiveness should completely remove all traces of sin, just as God, when he looks upon a sinner who has been forgiven, God looks as though you have never sinned before. For we are covered with the righteousness of Christ, and we appear holy and righteous before God. That is how God treats one another. It is this wonderful lesson that we see this proverb teaching us. Don't let your relationships, the way how you deal with one another, be inhumane, unloving, oppressive. For then how a storm would destroy a crop. That same water which the plant needs for its growth, when it comes with a different intensity, is destroying. Likewise, we too, in our spiritual life, we may make our relationships, instead of becoming strong, making forgiveness practical and helping others to be lifted up. We should never become the source of holding grudge against others, not willing to forgive our fellow human beings. For Paul says, we all have fallen short of God's glory and have sinned and fallen short of his glory. We are to ever be willing to forgive others as God forgives. That's what we say in our Lord's Prayer that Jesus taught us, that we forgive one another as God forgives us. If you experience God's forgiveness, you should give the same to our fellow human beings and never try to oppress a poor to oppress another poor person. May God help each one of us today as we look to God, who is ever so generous, ever so faithful, and ever willing to forgive us as many times we forgive those as we have sinned against God, that we should be willing to forgive those who have sinned against us. That this experience will help us, each one, to be drawn closer to one another and to God, who is our great forgiver. May God bless each one of us and have a blessed day.